Blog Talk Radio.
Radio brings you The Haunted Sea with host Scott Mardis.
Hello, this is Scott Mardis. Welcome to part 2 of our roundtable discussion about the ZUIYO MARU case. Joining me for this, as last time, are Andy McGrath. Hello, Andy.
Hey, Scott. How you doing?
Good. And Carrick St. Laurent. Hello, Carrick.
Hi, Scott. Thanks for having me on.
Yep. So, I want to try to avoid backtracking and spending half the episode talking about things that we talked about in the last episode. So I'm encouraging the audiences that if you haven't heard part 1 of this, please go back and listen to the first part so we don't have to go back and review all this stuff. We're going to be hopping around different things today. One thing that I definitely want to get into on this episode is the meat of the whole biochemistry argument for it being a shark, which is very important because the fibers that were taken from the fin or flipper are the hardest evidence we have to work with. It's the only physical evidence that was there, biological, to work with in this case. I would include the photographs as hard evidence as well, but you can't biologically analyze a photograph. So the only biological pieces of this animal that were available for study were the tissue samples taken from one of the fins. So that constitutes the only physical evidence in this case that could be analyzed. Now, before we get into that, I want to discuss some of the anatomical features that were used to argue that it was a shark. But I also want to look at the credentials of the people that said that they thought it was a reptile. Who are these people? Now, hang on a second here. Let's see. I'm looking for the chat option here. Let's see.
Close to the bottom. Yeah, bottom left.
Let's see. Hang on here.
No problem.
I found it. Now let me find the image I'm looking for. Let's see. Bear with me here.
Don't worry.
Let me see. Okay. You guys got that image?
Yes, we do.
All right, hang on a second here. All right, the first person that was quoted in the press as saying that it was a plesiosaur was this man. This is Yoshinori Imazumi.
Hmm.
March 11th, 1914 to April 7th, 2007, was a Japanese zoologist. He is known for describing the Inamote cat in 1967. He was the director of the zoological department of the National Museum of Nature and Science in Japan. And here's what he says. It's not a fish, whale, or any other mammal, said Professor Yoshinori Imazumi of Japan's National Science Museum in the Asahi Shimbun newspaper story that broke the news to the world. It's a reptile, and the sketch looks very like a plesiosaur. This was a precious and important discovery for human beings that seems to show that these animals are not extinct after all.
Wonderful.
So, I just told you his credentials. So,
Right.
I think that's wonderful.
this guy was respected in the field of zoology, and you must give his opinion some weight. But now we have to look at this in context, too. The story had just broke. There had not really been any real in-depth analysis of the testimony of the crew, to my knowledge. And perhaps it's possible that this guy did not know about the extensive history of mutilated basking sharks. I don't know. But anyway, you can take that for what it is. Now let me find the other slides I'm looking for here. Let's see. Bear with me.
No problem.
Yeah. Okay, this slide I just sent you is about Tokyo Shikama. All right, hang on here. Okay, so his credentials are Tokyo Shikama 1912 to 1978, Japanese malacologist and paleontologist. Now, a malacologist is somebody that studies gastropods and mollusks, and can include the study of cephalopods as well. Okay, so here's what he had to say. He was also quoted in newspapers around the same time. It says, Tokyo Shikama, a scholar of ancient animals at Yokohama National University, said, it has to be a plesiosaurus. These creatures must still roam the seas off New Zealand feeding on fish. He called the area an ideal habitat, abounding in fish and with a surface temperature of about 50 degrees Fahrenheit. This is from Wire Service Reports, July 25th, 1977. And related to Tokyo Shikama, there's a rare defense of his opinion by an American biologist from a different source. This is from an article that appeared in Starlog magazine in 1977. And here's what it says. Tokyo Shikama, an ancient animal expert at Yokohama National University, identified the creature indeed as being a plesiosaur, and a University of Chicago biology professor, Lee Van Valen, agreed, saying, if Shikama says it's a plesiosaur, it must be a plesiosaur. He's worked on marine mammals and is a respected expert. Van Valen added that he is fairly well convinced there is something big in Loch Ness as well. Okay. Not long after the initial reports, there were biochemical comparisons done with fin fibers from a blue shark. And it was found to be similar in nature biochemically to the elastoidin fibers from the fins of a blue shark. Now, when this came out, there's a quote from Shikama regarding that result. And here's what he said. He says, even if the tissue contains the same protein as the shark's, it is rash to say that the monster is a shark, said Professor Tokyo Shikama, a paleontologist at Yokohama National University. The finding is not enough to refute a speculation that the monster is a plesiosaur.
Wow.
Yeah.
And
these are hard quotes.
And these are strong credentials. They're strong
Exactly.
credentials.
So, again, this is in the early stages of the investigation. So, you could make the argument, well, they didn't really know that much at this point about the carcass.
Mm.
And he's basing his opinion on scant information. Nevertheless, you can't just sweep this guy's opinion under the rug, even under those circumstances.
Right.
All right, so finally, this is after the main part of the investigation was done by the scientists that met at Tokyo University of Fisheries and had this conference to really study in depth the evidence. At the end of the day, there was one or two people there that didn't say it was a plesiosaur, but did say it was possible that it was, quote, an undescribed reptile.
Mm.
Now, the lead person that expressed that opinion was Ikiwo Obata. Hang on a second here, and I'll send you that slide. All right, you got it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so I'm going to read his credentials.
Heard it.
Ikiwo Obata, Japanese paleontologist, born November 15th, 1929, Fukuoka, Japan, died September 19th, 2015, education, Kyushu University. Now, this guy worked on both vertebrate and invertebrate paleontology, wrote several papers about plesiosaurs. So he knew about plesiosaurs and probably mosasaurs as well. But he also worked on ammonites, which were the shelled squids that were contemporaries with the plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, and which a lot of them fed on. So here is a list of some of his papers that he wrote. I'm just going to read through them real quick. Let's see. This is from 1972, Preliminary Report on the Cretaceous Reptile Fossils from Hokkaido, Memories of the National Science Museum, number 5. This is from 1989, an Upper Cretaceous plesiosaur, family Elasmosauridae, from the Wakanai area, Hokkaido, Bulletin of the National Science Museum, Tokyo, Series C15. Here's another one from 2007, Geological Age and Environments of the Plesiosaurs and Mosasaurs from Japan, in Jubilee publication in commemoration of Professor Kamai's 80th birthday, Office of the Jubilee Events, in commemoration of Professor Kamai's 80th birthday, Tokyo. So obviously, here's another one from 1970, Discovery of an Elasmosaur from the Upper Cretaceous, Futaba Group, Journal of Geological Society of Japan, number 76. Okay, so that obviously establishes right there from these 3 or 4 papers that he's written on plesiosaurs and mosasaurs that he knows about marine reptiles. Right? So we've established that fact right there. Then coming back to the collected papers on the carcass of an unidentified animal trawled off New Zealand, these are the concluding remarks of his paper, which he co-authored with another invertebrate paleontologist named Yoshio Tomoda. The paper is called Comparison of the Unidentified Animal with Fossil Animals. Concluding remarks. there is still no decisive evidence to determine whether the animal in question was a shark or an undescribed reptile. General opinion favors identification as a shark. A possible method to approach a more accurate identification may be to focus on the basking shark, Cedorhinus maximus, which occurs in the cold waters of the northern hemisphere. Yet, a biologist who's inclined to the shark concept told us he had an impression when he recently had an opportunity to see a large specimen of the basking shark, that the animal in question would not be a basking shark. In this note, we dared to present an uncommon view, posing several questions to the now prevailing general opinion. After all, whether the animal belongs to a group of sharks or whether it is a marine reptile, we do not know any genera or species that agree with it. So basically, we have a guy that has worked on plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, not saying it was a plesiosaur or a mosasaur, but saying that it was possible that it was an undescribed reptile, which, like I said before, that's an unknown type of giant sea-dwelling reptile that we don't know about.
Right.
And apparently, it's got a long neck. If it was a reptile, it has a long neck like a plesiosaur, so it resembles a plesiosaur if it was a reptile. So, given so many unknown factors, just because it's an undescribed reptile does not rule out the possibility that it could be something descended millions of years removed from a plesiosaur or a mosasaur that we don't know about. So this is after most of the main investigation had been done. This is in the final papers from 1978 that everybody likes to quote from to prove it's a shark. So there you go. That's the best case that can be made for that thing being a reptile.
Right.
Are those three sets of quotes from those three zoologists, paleontologists, paleobiologists, whatever you want to call them. So that's as good as it gets in the state of the original investigation. Now, since that happened, I have uncovered other evidence that I think that you can add to that says that some of the evidence that was used to prove it was a shark is kind of ambiguous and could be applied to a reptile as well. Yeah. So,
it's...
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to comment one thing about Obata's analysis. It's so interesting that he didn't go with plesiosaur or mosasaur, but seemed to... His testimony suggests that there is something about the carcass that is not even specifically plesiosaur-like, but is strangely reptile-like. I think that was a very interesting point for him to make.
As I explained it earlier in the first episode, earlier in that paper, they did direct comparisons with known types of fossil plesiosaurs and mosasaurs.
Yes, right.
And they came to the conclusion that the body was too elongated to fit with any kind of known plesiosaur, and the neck was too long to fit with any type of mosasaur. So you had an animal with an elongated body like a mosasaur, but with an elongated neck like a sea turtle or a plesiosaur. So it didn't really fit either one. At least the known fossil types.
Right.
But as I've stressed before, we're dealing with an animal that's 66 or 65 million years removed from any of those fossil types. So we don't know what 60 million years of evolution could have done to one of these animals.
And I think that's a good point, Scott. I think it's like imagining, for example, that there are no big cats in the world now, and all we have as evidence of their existence are saber-toothed tigers. And then suddenly somebody finds a decomposing lion or tiger or leopard or whatever. And we say, well, it doesn't really fit anything that we have on record for that time. Maybe it is this, maybe it's not that. It does appear to be a cat of some kind. We don't know what it is, and surely, since we've seen over time, whatever the perspective is, that animals do change, even according to the environmental conditions, and vary.
Well, we don't even really know. We don't really know all the types that were running around 60 million years ago, much less today. Because we're constantly finding new types of marine reptiles and new types of dinosaurs, and some really weird ones that we didn't know about.
Yeah, the fossil record
who knows,
is considerably extensive, but in all reality, what we have in the fossil record, not just for marine reptiles, but for any species, is it's quite small. It's rare that a corpse fossilizes. So you're right. We're working with a very limited view of those time frames.
Absolutely.
Trying to be conservative, though, what we can say is that based on the trends that we know about the evolution of plesiosaurs and the evolution of mosasaurs, it doesn't fit either one. From what we know in the fossil record. But there could have been some side branch that maybe we don't even know about yet that could account for this animal. I don't know.
And again, I would say it's because it's that record, it's fragmentary. And to view it any other way I think is a mistake, because, as you said, we are finding new forms all the time, new species all the time. And the assumption about how the animal would have evolved or developed over time is based on that fragmentary evidence. And perhaps we'll find more in the future that will prove otherwise. There are new ideas coming around all the time. However, could it also just be an unknown form of shark, something that also doesn't exist in the fossil record, as far as we know? And
now that you mentioned that, I would mention the fact that about 5 months before the ZUIYO MARU carcass was found, they pulled up a big sea anchor off Hawaii and brought up the first megamouth shark, which was totally unknown in Hawaii. A totally unknown type of filter-feeding shark that apparently is distantly related to the basking sharks. So there you go. That's another possibility.
And huge. A huge animal.
Yeah. So the ZUIYO MARU thing happened right on the heels of the discovery of megamouth.
That's very interesting that it wasn't assumed to be one of those, right? Especially as it was on the heels. I think it's an interesting thing. I still come back to that point of many of the carcasses that have been found since that time, and since investigative science has moved on, have been determined absolutely to be basking sharks. And it's strange that we have that gap between them, between this particular sighting and what came out of it, and then everything afterwards almost conclusively being a shark or a basking shark or some other known species.
The problem is they didn't bring the carcass or enough of the carcass back to settle the matter. Most of the times, one thing that sets the ZUIYO MARU case apart from all these other cases, that all these other basking sharks have been found washed up on the beach. So it was not a problem to get access to take part of the skull or some of the vertebrae, or to get a piece of tissue to do a DNA analysis on to conclusively identify what it was. Now, I maintain that if the cranium and some of the vertebrae, maybe one of the flippers, were brought back up the ZUIYO MARU carcass, we wouldn't be sitting here having this conversation. They would know for sure what it was.
Right.
Fortunately, that didn't happen.
Yeah.
So that's the dividing line right there.
But still, these, as you point out with these slides, these reputable scientists, and especially reputable scientists in a country like Japan, where your reputation is everything, not only about you, but about your entire family, would take such a risk on something like this that could possibly have been a shark. It surprises me. It really does surprise me that they would have taken such a huge risk and been so so academically positioned to make such statements as well.
Well, I can see people, like I said, I can see people brushing aside the opinions of Imazumi and Shikama because at that point in time when those quotes were made, there hadn't really been an in-depth analysis of the evidence. But looking at what Obata said is a different story. This was the end result of an in-depth look at the evidence. So even at the end of the day, somebody was bold enough to say it could have been a reptile. So there you go. That's the important part there.
Right.
You take what Obata said, who was knowledgeable about plesiosaurs and mosasaurs, and add that to what Shikama and Imazumi said, then you've got something to work with. Yeah. So if you guys don't mind, I'm going to pause the recording and let's take a little break here.
Sounds good.
Absolutely.
All right.
Absolutely.
Okay, we're back now. And I think the next thing I want to discuss is the fact that the man that examined the carcass closer than anyone else on board the ship, the man that photographed it 5 times, took the measurements and cut the tissue samples, Mr. Michihiko Yano, who was a trained marine biologist that worked on board the ship for Taiyo Fisheries, was interviewed 29 years after the event and still maintains that he didn't think it was a shark. So that, to me, that's very important. So there was a German documentary made in 2006 about the ZUIYO MARU carcass. Michihiko Yano was interviewed for the documentary, and my German colleague, Marcus Hemmler, was kind enough to translate the interview from the German documentary into English. So what I'm about to read to you is the transcript, the English translation of Yano's interview for that documentary. Now I just have to bring up the file. Okay, so this is directly from Michihiko Yano himself. All right, hang on. Okay. The first part of this is written by Marcus Hemmler. Scott Martis pointed me to this German documentary, Monster aus der Teeth, Übenkant Erziatri, from German television channel ZDF 2006, mainly about the ZUIYO MARU carcass of 1977. I have translated the interview of Michihiko Yano from German to English. Now this is the quotes from Yano. I do not know the exact dimensions anymore, but the head was about 3/4 of a meter long. We tied a rope around the neck and pulled up the carcass. At the front, 2 fins were visible, as can be seen in the photos, and in the back, I believe, too. All internal organs were gone. When we pulled up the carcass in the net, white fat dripped out like tofu. You could also see red meat like a whale. If the crew had said back then, that's a shark, I would not have taken any pictures. But we had never seen anything like it. What was it? We knew about sharks. We process sharks every day. We were very experienced in that. So there you go. That's from Michihiko Yano himself.
That's the first hand, that's the eyewitness. That's still huge. And again, I asked the question, why do we always, these people, these amazing credentials, when they present something to us that's hard to believe, why do we find a way to discredit them or brush it off? It's a strange...
Well, It's very complicated. You look at the basic facts in the case now, and the way they were understood in 1978, just taking the basic facts, the fact that the biochemical analysis in comparison to elastoidin fibers from a basking shark were extremely close. You add to that the great resemblance of the carcass in the photographs to other well-documented cases of mutilated basking sharks that had happened before and have happened since. It's not unreasonable to say that the most parsimonious interpretation was that it was simply a mutilated basking shark.
Of course.
Right.
The most logical explanation.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay, so, using Occam's razor, that is the simplest explanation. However, if you look further afield, outside of the limited set of control data that they used to compare it with, you find other information that makes a lot of the features that they pointed to as being confirmatory of it being a shark, makes those features ambiguous and reopens the question to an extent.
Okay.
Now you take that information and add it to the opinions of Imazumi, Obata, and Shikama, and you just, seriously, if you're being honest, you can't just sweep all this under the rug. Now, looking at it realistically at this late date, the only chance we've ever got, and it's a very thin one, of conclusively closing this case is based on the possibility that one fiber was still in existence in Shizuoka University in 1996, 25 years ago. We don't know if it's still there or not. Even if it is, and we could get access to it, we don't know what 40 years of deterioration could have done to that one little piece of fiber that might hamper any ability to try to get a usable DNA sequence out of it now.
Right.
It is possible, but it's a very slim possibility. So, other than that possibility, we're left with an open-ended case that depends on what your point of view is. If you've got an absolutely closed mind that it could be absolutely nothing but a shark or a basking shark, then there's probably very little that's going to change your opinion. However, I think that looking at this case today, in the scope of wider evidence concerning things that we've learned about fossil marine reptiles in the last 40 years, that makes a lot of the knowledge that we have about things like plesiosaurs and mosasaurs and ichthyosaurs much more fishy-like than we initially assumed, and looking at things like leatherback turtles and other things, you can go back and re-examine some of this stuff and say, hey, wait a minute. There's even stuff related to the fibers in elastoidin that weren't mentioned in the original studies that may give us pause to say, hey, wait a minute. And I'm going to address all that, but I think the first thing we need to do, moving toward the biochemical analysis, is let's look at the first biochemical analysis where the fibers from the carcass were compared with a blue shark before the basking shark studies were done.
Right.
So what I've got to do now is go find that information. If you will bear with me for a minute, I'll dig that up. Feel free to talk while I'm looking for that.
Okay. Can we slag people off, or are you going to edit it out, or what? Kidding. Go, Carrick, go.
Well, I was gonna say I think it's super interesting, Scott, that you point out the whole, it could really easily go either way if you look at the case in a very holistic sense. And in that way, relating it to the biochemical analysis that we're about to take a look at here, I think that that's exactly the right way to look at this, in the sense that we have fairly sound, maybe not totally sound, but fairly sound conclusions that can be come to. And really, the meat of the case is in the process of the examination and why it produced such an ambiguous feeling case, rather than the fact that it produced an ambiguous case.
Well, best case possible scenario, you want to argue that this thing is a reptile, you've got a highly doubtful maybe at best. Still, that's better than nothing.
Right.
If you're coming at this question from the direction that we are, that we've been investigating these stories of plesiosaur-like, alleged plesiosaur-like water monsters, and you're looking for evidence that they are flesh and blood animals, you can't ignore this case.
Right.
Because you had reputable biologists that were bold enough to come forward in the face of much opposition to say that, hey, this might have been a reptile.
And that's the most interesting question, I think, for me at least, about this case is why? And I think that
why would they take that risk, Carrick? Why would they take that risk? And
I didn't make them say this. They said it themselves.
Right.
Exactly.
Right.
But look at the statement again. We knew about sharks. We processed sharks every day. We were very experienced in that. If the crew had said back then it's a shark, I would not have taken any pictures. We'd never seen anything like it. That's an eyewitness, first-hand eyewitness, the person that made a report. And I think this is the kind of stuff we don't invest enough into sometimes. People, especially people in that part of the world who eat a wide variety of food from the sea, they are going to be very experienced in that.
Well, you see, we haven't gone over all the evidence yet. There are counter arguments to that. There are places in the scientific paper where certain ichthyologists took the fibers and showed them to shark fin processors. These type of fibers in sharks are used for shark fin soup. The fibers from the carcass were taken and shown to professional shark fin processors who recognized them as elastoidin fibers.
Okay.
So, there's counter evidence in that direction too. And one thing that we haven't got to yet is that in late 1977, a basking shark was brought ashore by some Japanese fishermen and purposely trimmed to look like the carcass. And it does bear a strong resemblance to the carcass. They've cut the jaws off and they've cut the gills off and purposely trimmed it to look like the carcass. And we'll get to that eventually, but let's, this is an article that was published in Oceans Magazine in November 1977 called What Was the New Zealand Monster? So I'm going to find the section where they're talking about the blue shark comparison. Let's see. Let me see here. Bear with me.
No problem.
There's just so much material here to go over, I wish there was a way I could just open all the PDFs at once and have it laid out.
As this may make you
but unfortunately. All right, here we go. This is from the same article. It says, besides taking pictures of the creature, Yano had snipped some tissue samples of fibrous material from one of the fins for analysis. As soon as he returned Tests began on these specimens. About a week after the news of the monster first broke, on July 21st, the early reports came in. Using a method known as ion exchange chromatography to determine the amino acid... Oh, hang on a second here. Using a method known as ion exchange chromatography to determine the amino acid structure of the protein in the fiber strands, Yano had given him Dr. Shigeru Kimura, a biochemist at the Tokyo University of Fisheries, found that for every 1,000 units of amino acids in the monster tissue, 40 were of a type called tyrosine. The amino acid structure of a bluefin shark averaged 44 units of tyrosine per 1,000 of amino acids, which Kimura said represented a remarkable correlation. Among fish, it is known that only sharks and rays have the type of protein called elastoidin, Dr. Kimura said. As for reptiles, I do not think there is relevant data, even abroad. He added that the protein could not have come from a mammal's skin or hair. Thus, chemically, the monster may have been either a fish or possibly a reptile, but not a mammal. So.
Interesting.
Yeah. And then here's that same quote from Shikama again. It says, even if the tissue contains the same protein as the sharks, it is rash to say that the monster is a shark. Said Professor Tokyo Shikama, a paleontologist at Yokohama National University. The finding is not enough to refute a speculation that the monster is a plesiosaur.
And I think that really, that quote is so summative of all of the biochemical analyses that were done. It is, in my opinion, looking at all of this, I don't think there were enough control tests that were done, and we'll find that as we talk more about it.
That's one thing I'm going to explain as we move along. First, what I want to do is establish the parameters of the basking shark biochemical analysis from the final papers, and then backtrack from there, moving in a reptile direction. You'll see the logic of where I'm going with all this.
All right.
Now, there is a newspaper article that I have about the blue shark comparison. I just got to find it here. Let's see. Okay, this is from the New York Times. I believe July 25th, 1977. All right. Let me just read this real quick. Japanese say that sea creature could be related to shark species. Tokyo, July 25th. A marine biologist says a 30-foot, 2-ton sea creature netted by a Japanese trawler off New Zealand in April showed a biochemical makeup similar to that of a kind of shark. A spokesman for Professor Fujio Yasuda of Tokyo Fisheries University said today that a gas chromatography analysis of a whisker-like specimen from the creature showed it contained various amino acids seen in a species of shark, Cryonoche glauca, that usually grows to a maximum length of 18 feet. Yasuda stressed that the report is strictly tentative, and what it shows is that only that the monster could have been a shark, not that it was nothing but a shark, the spokesman said. Prior to the chemical analysis, the professor said the creature resembled an extinct sea reptile of 130 million years ago. The trawler ZUIYO MARU fished up the dead creature and sent a specimen and photographs to Tokyo for analysis. The rotted carcass was thrown back because crewmen feared it would contaminate the catch. All right, so why don't we break for now, and we'll pick this back up on the next session, and we'll get into the basking shark biochemical analysis.
Sounds good.
Awesome, awesome. Sorry, guys. Yeah, I'm flagging very seriously. It's a
That's all
couple
right. You had a busy day at work. I mean, we got time.
6 out of the house by 6 a.m.
Yeah.
I'm home tomorrow though. I'm home, so that's something
Awesome.
I can. Yeah. Anyway, I'm going to stop moaning. It's a British pastime. I gotta.
Okay, so what we need to do now is go to the much lauded 1978 paper that everyone points to as saying, see, the biochemical test proved that it was a basking shark. So what I intend to do here is us go through that paper point by point and first establish the arguments that were used to say that biochemically it was a basking shark. Then once we get to that point, we'll start bringing in new evidence to deconstruct that argument. So, this is from the collected papers on the carcass of an unidentified animal trawled off New Zealand by the ZUIYO MARU, published by the Franco-Japanese Société d'Oceanography in July 1978, based on a series of papers that came out of a conference held by a bunch of scientists at the Tokyo University of Fisheries. The name of this paper is The Morphology and Chemical Composition of Horny Fibers from an Unidentified Creature Captured off the Coast of New Zealand. The primary author is a biochemist named Shigeru Kimura, and his co-authors are Katsuyuki Fuji, Hajime Sato, Tsuyoshige Seta, and Minoru Kubota, who I'm all assuming are probably biochemists as well. Now, if you'll remember from earlier in this episode, Shigeru Kimura is the one that did the initial biochemistry test comparing the carcass fibers with those from a blue shark, Prionice glauca, and found that they were very similar. Okay, so I'm going to read the abstract of the paper here. Abstract: the only material evidence horny fiber from an unidentified creature captured off the coast of New Zealand was characterized with respect to its hydrothermal behavior, electron microscope observation, and chemical composition. From the combined results, the horny fiber was identified as a unique collagenous fiber, elastoidin, which has been reported to occur only in shark fins. Especially, it was almost identical to a basking shark elastoidin in its amino acid composition. Thus, these findings may lead to the conclusion that the unidentified creature is a basking shark or a closely related species to it. Now I'm off into the main part of the paper. It says, on April 25th, 1977, the ZUIYO MARU of Taiyo Fishery Company, a Japanese fishing trawler, happened to drag up the corpse of a big strange creature resembling the legendary Nessie about 30 miles east off the coast of Christchurch, New Zealand. The creature measured up to 10 meters long. The dead body, however, was soon thrown away for fear of contaminating other fish with putrid substances. Just before it was thrown away, Michihiko Yano, one of the crewmen, had pulled out several horny fibers from the half-decayed pectoral fin or foreleg. These horny fibers resemble a unique collagenous fiber, elastoidin, from the fins of sharks, class chondrichthyes in their appearance. On the other hand, Yano's color photographs and sketches of the creature, as well as many verbal reports of the crewman, seem to support the possibility that it is not a fish. Thus, it would be expected that a biochemical study of the isolated horny fiber may provide significant information about this unidentified creature. The present paper reports the morphological and chemical characteristics of the horny fiber in relation to those of shark elastoidin. Materials and methods. Samples. 2 pieces of the horny fibers from the pectoral fin about 100 centimeters in length of the creature were kindly provided by Professor Fujio Yasuda, Tokyo University of Fisheries, who was requested by Taiyo Fishery Company to give an opinion of the creature. According to Yano's report, the horny fibers were washed with water in order to remove their terrible smell, treated with an antiseptic solution of about 0.4% sodium hypochlorite at room temperature for 12 hours, then air dried on the trawler. Direct comparison was made with the elastoidin from the basking shark Cedarinis maximus, because some adult basking sharks are comparable to the creature in their whole body length. Elastoidins were prepared from a fresh pectoral fin about 40 centimeters in length, and any loose substance surrounding the elastoidin was removed by washing it with water. Electron microscopy. The horny fibers were macerated in 1% acetic acid, washed with physiological saline, and fixed for 2 hours with 2.5% glutaldehyde in 1.1 M-phosphate buffer, pH 73 at 4 degrees Celsius. After washing with the same buffer, they were post-fixed for 1 hour and 1% osmium tetraoxide at 4 degrees Celsius. A portion of them was ion spattered with gold and examined in a U3 type scanning electron microscope. Another portion was dehydrated with an ethanol series embedded in spur resin in sections longitudinally. These sections were stained with lead citrate and uranyl acetate and examined in an HS/9 transmission electron microscope. All right, well, now, obviously that's mostly gibberish to what, but obviously they treat it with chemicals and all that stuff, which I'm assuming is the normal process they do to make this stuff show up better in an electron microscope.
Right. And it's interesting that it's noted that 12 hours was the wait time for it, because there is obviously some concern over how much time is needed for that sample to start degrading because of its preservation method. Well,
I'm sure there's method to their madness.
Right.
Anyway, moving along, it says chemical analysis. Amino acid compositions of the horny fiber and the shark elastoidin were determined by an amino acid analyzer, JLC 3BC liquid chromatograph. The samples were hydrolyzed in 6-degree hypochlorite at 110 degrees Celsius for 24 hours under reduced pressure. 2 kinds of carbohydrate-linked hydroxylysines, glucosylgalactosylhydroxylysine and galactohydroxylysine were estimated by the amino acid analyzer according to the method as described by Kimura, 1972, in samples hydrolyzed in 2 NKOH at 105 degrees Celsius for 20 hours. Furthermore, reducible cross-links were identified using the method reported by Tanzer et al. 1973. The samples were reduced with tritiated sodium borohydride, hydrolyzed in 3NHCl at 107 degrees Celsius for 48 hours, and then fractioned on a 0.9 by 15 centimeter column of Aminex A5, whatever that means. Okay, now results and discussion. Now we're moving on. So basically the section we just discussed was materials and methods. outlining all the different preparation techniques that were used on the fibers before the tests were done, including the electron microscope, hydrothermal test, and the amino acid test. Now here we go with the actual tests and the results. Results and discussion. Morphology, which is the shape of the physical parameters of these fibers. The horny fibers were rigid needle-like fibers with a translucent light brown color, which taper toward both ends. This fiber shrinks sharply to about 1/3 of its original length at approximately 63 degrees Celsius when heated in water. On cooling, the shrunk fiber became re-elongated gradually. Figure 2 compares the wet horny fibers before and after heat treatment. Both having the same original length of 3.5 centimeters. This type of hydrothermal behavior was characteristic of elastoidin. In this connection, the basking shark elastoidin was found to have a shrinkage temperature of approximately 65 degrees Celsius. So there was a 2 degrees Celsius difference in the shrinkage temperature of the basking shark elastoidin and the carcass fibers.
Interesting.
What the significance of that is, I do not know. Does anyone? Anyway, moving along to the electron microscope examination, it says, the scanning electron micrograph shown in Figure 3 exhibited that the horny fiber was composed of numerous protofibrils arrayed parallel to the fiber axis. Furthermore, the transmission electron micrograph of longitudinal section of the horny fiber is given in Figure 4. Let's see. Which the particular band pattern was observed over the entire field of view in the electron microscope. The major periodic striation of 450 to 500 amps was rather shorter than that of 600 to 700 amps for typical collagen. A similar characteristic pattern was previously observed by McGavin, 1962, in the longitudinal section of basking shark elastoidin. So basically what they're saying there, these rings that go around the collagen fibril are shorter in elastoidin than they are for normal collagens. And they're saying that you see that same sort of pattern in basking shark elastoidin when it's looked at under an electron microscope.
Right.
All right. So here we go with the actual biochemical test. It says chemical characteristics. The amino acid composition of the horny fiber is shown in Table 1, indicating that more than 95% of the horny fiber by weight was accounted for by these amino acids. Although its composition was characteristic of collagenous proteins, an unusual feature of the horny fiber was found to be the high tyrosine content of 43 residues for every 1,000 amino acid residues, compared with about 5 residues or less per 1,000 residues for collagen. In this respect, the horny fiber resembled elastoidins thus far known, especially the basking shark elastoidin listed in Table 1 was closely similar to the horny fiber, although that it was obviously rich in tyrosine and histidine as compared with the horny fiber. Now, if you'll remember, the tests that were done on the blue shark elastoidin, I think, was about 44 units for every 1,000 units was tyrosine.
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah. So this is coming along the same parameters.
Mm.
Anyway, going back to the text, it says, in this regard, it is noteworthy that the horny fiber preparation had been treated with a dilute sodium hypochlorite solution, which is a strong oxidizing reagent. The aqueous sodium hypochlorite solution is very unstable, so that the sodium hypochlorite concentration, 0.4%, reported by Yano, should be considered as maximal. The action of sodium hypochlorite on collagenous proteins is not yet clear, but some amino acids were reported to be susceptible to the oxidation by chemical oxidizing reagents.
Mm-hmm.
Thus, the basking shark elastordins were treated with 0.4% and 0.007% solutions of sodium hypochlorite at room temperature for 24 hours, and then analyzed for their amino acids.
Mm.
So in other words, they took the basking shark elastordins, treated them with the same chemical treatment that the carcass fibers had been treated with, and then redid the test.
Right.
To see what the results were. Thus, the basking shark elastordins were treated with 0.04% and 0.007% solutions of sodium hypochlorite at room temperature for 24 hours and then analyzed for their amino acids. Figure 5 shows that tyrosine, histidine, cysteine, and methionine residues for the elastordin were specifically decomposed by the action of sodium hypochlorite, whereas other amino acid residues remained intact. Thus, the horny fiber was found to have a strong resemblance to the elastordin treated with the 0.007% sodium hypochlorite rather than the intact elastordin in its amino acid composition. This striking similarity was confirmed by a difference index, which was proposed by Metzger et al. 1968. That is, the difference index calculated for the horny fiber and the sodium hypochlorite treated elastordin was the extremely low value of 0.95%. 0.95, suggesting that both proteins were almost identical with each other. The results of the determinations of the carbohydrate-linked hydrolaxines in the horny fiber and the elastordin are presented in Table 2. No significant difference was observed. They contained the total glycosylated hydroxylysine of approximately 2 residues per 1,000 residues, and about 40% of their total hydroxylysine was glycosylated. Moreover, the distribution of the disaccharide unit, GLE-GAL, and the monosaccharide unit, GAL, was found to be about 1-to-1 in both samples. In contrast to the amino acid composition described above, there was a marked difference between the horny fiber and the elastordin and the reducible cross-links, which are polyfunctional amino acids derived from lysine, hydroxylysine, and/or histidine residues. After the reduction with NAB3H4, the radioactivity of tritium incorporated into the horny fiber was about 110 ccm per UG of hydroxyproline, which is 1/7 of the specific radioactivity of the elastordin. The fact indicated that the horny fiber contained the extremely low amount of reducible cross-links compared to the elastordin. Chromatographic patterns of the radioactive compounds, Figure 6, showed that each of the horny fiber and the elastordin exhibited a unique pattern of the reducible cross-link formation. The horny fiber contained the comparable amounts of hydroxylysinoLeucine, lysinoleucine, and histidinohydroxymyrodesmosine. Did you guys get that?
Yeah.
Which are commonly observed in skin and tendon collagen. On the other hand, lysinoleucine was found to be the major reducible cross-link in the elastoidin. It is generally said that reducible cross-links are liable to decompose under relatively mild conditions. In addition, it has been reported that the specific radioactivity, which represents the total amount of reducible compounds, and the proportion of the reducible cross-links of collagen are found to decrease with age. Conceivably, the extremely low content and unique composition of the reducible cross-links in the horny fiber may be due to 1, the age-related changes in the reducible cross-links, or 2, the partial destruction of the reducible cross-links by sodium hypochlorite. At the present time, the effect of sodium hypochlorite on chemical structures of the reducible cross-links remains to be elucidated. So that tells me right there are questions regarding the effect of what exactly sodium hypochlorite could do to those fibers.
Right. Well, you've got that question, and I think the not exact but quite close similarity of the horny fibers to known elastoidin might also raise the question, since elastoidin is a type of collagen, if there is a detectable difference, maybe similar to that one, in other types of collagen compared to elastoidins.
Yeah, well, you see, we're opening up Pandora's box here, and
Yeah, right.
we'll take it out one piece at a time. But so here's the last paragraph of the paper. Thank God. All right, it says, it is certain that the sodium hypochlorite treatment of the horny fiber of the trawler threw our interpretation of the experimental results into confusion. Let me read that sentence one more time. Just take in the significance of that. It is certain that the sodium hypochlorite treatment of the horny fiber on the trawler threw our interpretation of the experimental results into confusion.
Wow.
All right? So that's right there saying, hey, wait a minute, we're not sure exactly 100% what's going on here. All right, now moving on, it says, the composite studies, however, indicated that the horny fiber was almost identical to the basking shark elastoidin in its morphology and amino acid composition. If the horny fiber was pulled out from an animal belonging to other classes except the chondrichthyes, it should be significantly different from the basking shark elastoidin in its amino acid composition, judging from the present knowledge of comparative biochemistry of collagenous protein. These results strongly suggest that the unidentified creature is a basking shark or a closely related species to it. So that's the end of the paper.
Wow.
So in one paragraph, they're talking about experimental results thrown into confusion. So
Yeah.
there's a lot of,
Yeah,
even within the limited amount of control data that they used here, there's still questions.
Right, and it really
you've got a
does.
firm conclusion. You don't have experimental results and confusion.
Yeah,
Now
that's
they're arguing that within the shaky parameters of the test that they did, it points toward it being a basking shark, when all they've compared it with are elastoidin fibers from a basking shark.
Yeah, it does kind of seem like the experiment overall has ignored the potential closeness of two very different substances. I mean, if this,
there's a lot of unanswered questions here.
yeah,
We
yeah,
know we know that there's another shark that gets as big as the basking shark, lives a similar lifestyle, called the whale shark.
right.
Now, you can look at the photographs, and you can compare that with the cranium of a whale shark and clearly tell that morphologically, based on the neurocranium, that creature was not a whale shark.
Right. So if it was going to be
where I'm going with this argument is why couldn't they have gotten the elastoidin of a whale shark to use as control data against the biochemical test?
or even some other kind of collagen-like material that isn't elastoidin. Because,
Yeah.
I mean
all
being a collagen.
all they used was the blue shark elastoidin in the first test and the basking shark fibers in the second test. What if they had done a test on whale shark elastoidin and found it was almost identical too?
Right. Well,
So
again,
what that would have told you is that you could not identify the species based solely on elastoidin fibers alone. But they didn't do that. And I don't know why they didn't do that, because that's not a very big leap, to just check other big shark species to make sure that you could identify a shark. Look how similar the results of the basking shark and the blue shark were.
that's the thing, is that these materials, whether they both be elastoidins of different species or whether they be collagens and other collagens or collagens and elastoidins, they're all so similar that using even just elastoidins might not have been enough. Maybe collagen that wasn't elastoidin should have been used to see if it was more similar to that.
Is the difference in tyrosine amount based on the size of the elastoidin fibers rather than the species? I don't know. Now, molecular biology has moved so far in advance from where it was in 1978. Now they can do a lot of stuff that they couldn't do back then.
Right.
I'm looking at this test from the perspective of what was the state of molecular biology in 1978 compared to what it is now.
Absolutely.
So within the limited parameters of the control data they use, they make a convincing argument.
That's the problem, though, is only within the parameters, and the parameters are too small to really be that conclusive.
Yeah, but now the people that are inclined to say it was a basking shark are working from more than just this biochemical analysis.
Right.
They're working from comparison with other mutilated basking shark carcasses, of the photographic evidence of the carcass, the testimony of the crew, and the physical morphology of the carcass compared to sharks and marine reptiles.
Right.
Now, we're not done analyzing that part of the argument yet, but we need to really deal with this biochemical aspect right now. So that is the whole of the 1978 papers, and I know a lot of it was meaningless gibberish to the audience. A biochemist would probably understand it fairly easy. Someone that's used to working with all these chemicals and doing all these preparatory things to these fibers in preparation for the test that you're going to do on.
Right.
They use all these chemicals and processes, and they heat things up and they cool them down. And this causes chemical reactions to get the chemicals that you want to analyze separated from other ones. They do a lot of the same stuff in modern day DNA analysis, because they have to separate the DNA fragments from other materials, and then they have to use chemical reagents to clone the DNA fragments that they've separated from other material to grow strands big enough to analyze it, if you can follow me there.
Yeah, it's a pretty complicated
That's a lot of what
process.
they do in modern DNA analysis.
Right.
To create DNA strands from fragments and all this to retrieve the original DNA strands and fragments of what they want to study.
Right.
Okay, where was I? Let's take a little break here.
Sounds good.
Yep. Okay, so I should point out that there were criticisms of the biochemical results from other scientists elsewhere in the 1978 papers. So with your permission, I'm going to go over those.
Go right ahead.
All right. The first is in the paper by Ikuo Obata and Yoshio Tomoda. Comparison of the unidentified animal with fossil animals. And if you'll remember, Ikuo Obata and Yoshio Tomoda were the ones that said they thought it could be an unidentified reptile.
Mm.
Okay, here's what they say in their paper. This is a direct quote. It says, the results of the amino acid composition of the horny fibers from the anterior fin provide strong support to the opinion that the animal was a species of shark. However, no chemical substances have thus far provided to be truly diagnostic for the classification of higher taxa of vertebrates. In spite of the modern biologists and paleontologists' eager desire to utilize chemical characteristics as clues to investigate animal phylogeny. As to the amino acid composition under discussion, we have been informed that comparative studies of some groups of animals show the existence of many amino acids common to all groups dealt with. It may be that qualitative data are not very useful for the discussion of phylogenetic relationships of animals. It is stated that some biochemists intend just to increase knowledge on the ratio of each amino acid composition in various animals. In this connection, the analysis of chondroitin sulfuric acid in animals, recently developed by Dr. Tatsuya Yamagata, was shown that the components differ between groups of animals. This method will make a great contribution toward the phylogenetic study of vertebrates. At the advice of Dr. Fujio Igami, Mitsubi Kaisei Institute of Life Science, we had Dr. Yamagata analyze 38 megagrams of dried horny fiber. From the sample 38 megagrams in dry weight, the presence of 38 mu moles of uronic acid was detected. This suggests the occurrence of mucopolysaccharide, but the scanty amount of the sample available was not permitted to verify its presence in the horny fiber. So there, you've got one criticism of the biochemical results.
Mm.
Let me find this other paper. Just a second here. Let's see. Bear with me here a second.
No problem.
Okay, this is a paper. It says, what the giant carcass trawled off New Zealand suggests to an ichthyologist by Tokiharu Abe that the giant carcass trawled by the fishing vessel ZUIYO MARU 30 miles off Christchurch, New Zealand on April 25, 1977 represents a giant shark is now believed to be true by some biochemists and biologists. Many people appear to have been disappointed to learn that the carcass seems not to be that of a living fossil and appear to regard the unusual excitement shown by Japanese journalists as ending in much ado about nothing. but the carcass has stimulated the writer's interest in the distribution and differences of ceratotrichia among lower vertebrates. Shark fin processors, to a few of whom the writer showed the ceratotrichia of the carcass for identification, are fairly knowledgeable about the differences in the nature of ceratotrichia of every fin of the majority of the sharks and guitar fishes handled by fish markets in Tokyo. At first, they identified the ceratotrichia of the carcass with that of a certain shark and later with that of the basking shark. Thanks to the efforts of some staff members of the Department of Science, the Asahi Press, Tokyo, samples of dried ceratotrichia of the basking shark, Cedorhinus maximus, from a shark fin processor were made available to the writer for comparison with those from the carcass. The ceratotrichia from these two sources resemble each other remarkably. In the absence of knowledge about ceratotrichia of other giant sharks, he is unable to state for certain whether the carcass was that of the basking shark or not. This short note is intended to expedite research into the distribution of ceratotrichia among various taxa of animals, both living and fossil, and differences between the fins of a single animal and between species or higher taxa. As stated by Zangerl, 1973, cartilaginous fin rays are present in modern, including Mesozoic elasmobranchs, but they are not often reduced in size, and ceratotrichia form the major fin supports regardless of the state of reduction of the cartilage radials. In Paleozoic elasmobranchs, ceratotrichia were considered to be absent except for some xenocants, where they were present in the paired and unpaired fins. Zangerl described a Pennsylvanian shark, that's the geologic period, Trichorhynchus precursor, as a new genus and new species based on the presumed pectoral fin, which is characterized by the presence of ceratotrichia covering presumed hidden radial elements as in modern forms. This suggests the possibility of finding ceratotrichia in other animals, both living and fossil. The writer expresses his sincere thanks to Mr. Matsuo Kawada and his two sons, Kochi and Terumi Kawada, for their help in identifying the ceratotrichia of the carcass from off New Zealand, to Dr. Humphrey Greenwood, British Museum, Professor Eugenie Clark, Mr. Charles McCann, and Miss Mahoko Horiguchi for their prompt replies to the writer's inquiries pertaining to the carcass off New Zealand and sea serpents, to Dr. Shigeru Kimura for valuable information about ceratotrichia, to the staff members of the Department of Sciences, the Asahi Press, Tokyo, and Professor Fujio Yasuda for their kindness in giving him opportunities to see ceratotrichia from the carcass from off New Zealand and those of the basking shark. So what he's talking about, when he was talking about ceratotrichia of radial elements, if you look at the way the pectoral fin and pelvic fins of sharks are built, you know how in a vertebrate limb you've got, at least in the leg bone, you've got a humerus, and then the tibia and fibula, and then the foot bones, right? You follow me?
Yep.
Okay, you look at a plesiosaur flipper, and you see the same humerus bone, and then you see these two short bones that correspond with the tibia and fibula. And then you've got the carpal bones, which are the flipper bones, which point to a wedge almost like a pizza slice.
Okay.
All right, so that's typically what the flipper of a secondarily aquatic tetrapod looks like. The basic construction of it. In an arm bone, it would be the oh, what are they called? The radius and ulna, and the humerus. And a leg bone, the same bone, would be called a femur.
Right.
So, sorry if I confused you there for a second. So anyway, that's essentially the way flippers are built in animals like sea turtles and whales and seals, particularly the front flippers. So anyway, you look at the inside of a shark fin, and you've got these blocks of cartilage called radials, which take up the same function as the femur, the tibia and the fibula, and the humerus, and the radius and ulna in a vertebrate limb, right?
Right.
Below those radial elements is where the elastoid and the ceratotrachea or actinotrachea in bony fish, which is the same thing, occurs. So you've got, in a fish fin, you've got these radial elements, and then below that you've got rays. In different types of fish, in more advanced fish, you have rays that are partially made out of cartilage, called lepidotrachea. And there's even a specialized type in lungfish called camptotrachea. Anyway, in bony fish, the elastoidin fibers are much shorter than what you see in sharks. They're real long in sharks. They're usually very short in bony fishes. And they sit on top of a cartilaginous piece, a cartilaginous ray called lepidotrachea. And then beyond that, you got this short fiber, the actinotrachea or elastoid in a bony fish. However, you can look at the skeletons of sailfish and see long elastoid fibers like you see in sharks. I've got pictures of that. I'll put it in the slideshow. So anyway, basically what this Dr. Abe was talking about is he's talking about the discovery of this shark that apparently had elastoidin fibers over the radial elements. So, moving along, and we'll come back to this, there has been found exceptionally preserved plesiosaur and ichthyosaur flippers that have collagen-like fibers of some kind over the toe flipper bones.
Huh.
So
Interesting.
there may possibly be something along the lines of, analogous at least, in function to ceratotrachea, which we'll get back to that. There's one more paper from the scientific papers regarding the fibers that I want to read real quick.
All right.
Hang on. I just got to find it. So give me some feedback here while I'm looking for that.
I mean, kind of the same as what I guess I've been saying so far, which is just it's a lot more complicated than most people paint it to be. And mostly because there's so many damn similarities between what could be marine or prehistoric reptiles and shark anatomy.
Yeah.
I mean, it's just, there's a lot.
As I said earlier in the shows, I mentioned the fact that we're finding out much more about these marine reptiles than we knew 40 years ago, and we're finding out that a lot of them were a lot more fishier in their biology than we initially assumed they were.
Right.
That we're starting to find fish-like features in mosasaurs and plesiosaurs that we thought only existed in ichthyosaurs. But now we're finding out that the plesiosaurs and mosasaurs were a lot fishier than we initially thought they were.
Right.
Andy, you've talked about going to See the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, right?
Yeah, that's actually not too
Okay.
far from me.
At the time that the Crystal Palace dinosaurs were made, they didn't know that ichthyosaurs had dorsal fins and fish-like tails.
That's right. That's right.
And
There's
if you
there's a
look at the
model there.
models,
Yeah.
if you look at the models from the Crystal Palace of the ichthyosaurs, they're shown sitting on rocks. Because
That's
they
true.
thought at that point in time that ichthyosaurs were amphibious. They didn't realize that ichthyosaurs had shark-like dorsal fins and shark-like lunate caudal fins until they discovered exceptionally well-preserved ichthyosaurs in Holzmaden in Germany that had skin impressions around the bones. And they found the skin impressions of the dorsal fin and the caudal fins. Then they realized they were much more fishier than they initially thought. But now the same thing is happening with mosasaurs and plesiosaurs. So here's the other paper. This is from the 1978 papers. And this was about an additional biochemical test that the results were not available by the time that the papers were published. Somewhere in my archives, I was able to find a reference to the later results of this test that came out after the initial papers were published. And I'll have to dig and find it, but this is a different type of biochemical test that was done on the fibers by a different set of scientists. So I'm going to read this real quick. It's very short.
Got it.
Okay, this is from the 1978 papers. It says, preparation of antibody to fin fiber by Tetsukichi Niwaguchi, Takako Inui, and Toru Kishi. The detailed biochemical analysis made by Kimura et al. Of the horny fiber from the carcass of the unidentified animal trawled off New Zealand has revealed that the fiber is closely similar in amino acid to the horny fin rays of the basking shark. Apart from their chemical study, a series of experiments is in progress in our laboratory in the hopes of providing immunological data for the identification of the horny fiber of the unidentified animal. Though collagens are generally known to be at best weak antigens, several studies have shown that immunogenicity of solubilized human and calf collagens. In order to obtain antibody against the horny fin fiber of the unidentified animal, rabbits were immunized with non-treated or solubilized fin fiber from the carcass. It is planned to verify the presence of antibody by means of complement fixation for non-treated fiber and by means of complement fixation and/or Australoni technique for solubilized fiber, and to test the cross-reaction of anti-serum with the horny fin rays of the basking shark. Following are the procedures for the experiment, part of which we have already been undertaken and part of which are still left to be completed. Preparation of antibody. 1. Experiment with non-treated fiber as an antigen. A piece of the horny fiber is powdered and suspended in physiological saline solution at a concentration of 10 milligrams of powder per milliliter. To the suspension is then added the same volume of complete Freund's adjuvant. This suspension is injected into the toe pads of a 2-kilogram rabbit at a dosage of 10 micrograms powder per animal 2 times in an interval of 2 weeks. The rabbits are bled 3 weeks after second injection. 2. Experiment with solubilized fiber as an antigen. The fin fiber is solubilized following the methods of Gallup and Seipter, 1963. Other procedures are the same as described above. 2, examination of antibody and cross-reaction. Antibody to the non-treated fibers. The reaction of the anti-serum with the powdered fiber of the unidentified animal and with the powdered fin ray from the basking shark is performed by means of complement fixation. 2, antibody of the solubilized fibers. The reaction of the anti-serum with the solubilized fiber of the unidentified animal and with the solubilized fin ray of the basking shark is examined by Alcrotoni technique and complement fixation method. The results of these immunological tests will provide an answer to the question whether or not the horny fin fiber of the unidentified animal from New Zealand is identical with the horny fin rays ceratotrichia of the basking shark. Also interesting are experiments with fin rays of other species of sharks. So apparently, this group of tests was going to involve tests with elastoid from other types of sharks. So somewhere in my archive, I recall reading that there were results eventually that came out of those tests. I just got to dig them out.
Okay.
So hopefully by our next session, I will find those, and we'll go over that too.
Great.
So I think maybe we should take a break for the day and pick this back up with the next session.
Agreed.
Yeah.
Sounds good,
We
Scott.
managed to get quite a bit done today, though. Hey, this is Scott Martis. We're back for another recording session on part 2 of our ZUIYO MARU special. Unfortunately, Carrick St. Laurent could not make it for this session because he had some kind of college thing that came up. So it's just me and Andy McGrath. Hello, Andy.
Hi, Scott. How are you?
Good. One thing I wanted to explain about our last recording session, 2 things. There is one part where you hear me talking extremely loud while I'm trying to read one of these papers. And the reason why I was talking so loud is one of my cats was trying to jump on the computer, and I was trying to continue reading the paper and at the same time warn the cat off of jumping on the computer. So obviously nobody could see the visual element of this, but that's what was going on.
I don't remember you speaking loudly.
Well, you can hear it earlier in this episode from the last recording session. And the other thing I want to clear up is, yes, I know the difference between a humerus and a femur. The only reason that I got them mixed up when I was talking about them is I was talking about them in the context of plesiosaurs. You look at a human arm and a human leg, and you can obviously tell the difference. But you look at 4 plesiosaur flippers, they all look the same. The femur bone and the humerus bone of a plesiosaur look almost exactly alike. So the difference between a leg and an arm on a plesiosaur is almost meaningless.
It's a positional difference.
Yeah. Whether they're connected to the pelvic girdle or the pectoral girdle is about the only real difference that I can. So, you got 2 bones in each back leg and each foreleg that correspond with each other. In the back flipper, it would be the radius, the tibia and fibula, and the femur. In the front flipper, it would be the humerus, the radius, and the ulna, like same bones you see in our arms. And then the hand bones would be the carpals, and the foot bones would be the tarsals. So anyway, I just want to get that cleared up. So anyway, last time we were talking, we left off at the paper about antibody to fin fiber, the tests they were doing with the rabbits.
That's right.
And I thought somewhere in my archives that I had a follow-up on that, because when the papers were published in 1978, they had not gotten their results in, so the results of those tests were not part of the 1978 papers. But I recall reading somewhere about that somebody had followed up on that, but I couldn't find it. But anyway, the basic idea of how those tests work is they were injecting these rabbits with serum from the ZUIYO MARU fibers and also from basking shark elastoidins to get the rabbits to produce antibody for each of them. Then they were going to compare those antibodies that they retrieved from the rabbits to see how similar they were.
Wow.
So it's complex biochemistry stuff, but anyway, that's essentially my understanding of what they were trying to do.
And it was successful?
I don't know. I haven't been able to find that follow-up. I dug through my archives. Since the last time we spoke, I have done nothing but dug in archives, getting ready for this next section. So, one thing that was said in the original papers that I want to point out, in the paper by Obata and Tomoda, which was the only one of the papers that had an open mind about the creature being a reptile, they made a mistake, an error. And I'm just going to read it real quickly from the paper. It says, comparison with fossil animals. They're comparing the carcass data with a plesiosaur. And it says, if the unidentified animal were a plesiosaur, it would have paired fins with a characteristic fibrows of phalange, but phalange were not observed in the carcass. A structure like the horny fiber of the fins is found in cetaceans, but not in marine reptiles. It is therefore no wonder that one may assume the animal to be a shark. So anyway, they were working under the assumption that the flippers of marine reptiles, plesiosaurs, ichthyosaurs, sea turtles, didn't have any fin rays. And that is simply not the truth, which I'm about to demonstrate here. But before we move on to that, I want to address another point. Give me a second here.
That's okay.
Yeah, let's see. All right. Now, based on what was going on in 1978, we know that shark fin processors that make a living, or made a living back then, processing shark fins for shark fin soup, were shown the fibers from the carcass and identified them as fibers similar to what they were used to working with. So based on that visual identification by shark finners, a lot of emphasis was put on the fact that these fibers from the carcass look like shark fin fibers. And that was impressive to a lot of people that were leaning toward the shark idea. Now, as we get into this, you'll see that fibers, the collagen fibers, which is basically what an elastoid fiber is, it's a modified collagen fiber that happens to have non-collagenous elements bonded with it at a molecular level. But it's basically a collagen fiber. If you look at isolated collagen fibers and elastoidins, just looking at them morphologically, they look pretty much exactly alike. So what I'm saying is I think you could have took any kind of collagen fibers from an animal and isolated them and went and showed them to shark fin processors, and they probably would have said, "Oh, that looks like fibers we process from shark fins." So I don't know
the
how
fibers in general would have a similarity to one
saying
another.
is, I don't know how much stock you can put in that.
Mm.
And another
That makes
interesting
sense.
question I looked into is just based on the biochemistry from a shark fiber, from a shark elastoidin fiber, would you be able to tell what species of shark it was? And I seem to have found some questions of that possibility as well. Hang on, let me find it. Let me see here. Okay, this is from a master's thesis at the University of Rhode Island from 1994 by Adele M. Al-Khwarizmi. And it's a master's thesis called Physicochemical Characterization of Shark Fins from 1994. And here's what it says. Amino acid analysis. As indicated in Table 25, the amino acid profile of elastoidin extracted from different shark species reveals no significant difference in chemical composition of their protein. The distribution of amino acids of elastoidin follow the general pattern of typical collagen. The glycine content is high, and the percentage of nonpolar amino acids is in the same range of the collagen. The hydroxy amino acid, hydroxyproline, is lower in elastoidin, which offset by a higher serine and threonine. So they used 3 different types of elastoidins in this study. They used elastoid from a hammerhead shark, a guitar fish, which is a type of shark relative very closely related to the sawfish, which you know is also a type of chondrichthyon, but it's not technically classified as a shark.
Mm-hmm.
They also use elastoids from a dogfish. And basically what the amino acid composition of all 3 of these different types of sharks was all the same. And the point I'm getting at here is, what if in 1978 they had pulled elastoidins from a whale shark, which we're pretty sure that the ZUIYO MARU carcass, if it was a shark, was not a whale shark based on the configuration of the neurocranium of a whale shark, which is very different from that of a basking shark.
Like a hammerhead almost.
Yeah. Technically, the whale shark is what they call an erectolobiform. That would include the wobbegong sharks and a couple of others. Maybe the angel shark. I'm not positively sure on that, but I suspect it probably is. But it's a totally different kind of shark from a basking shark. But my point is here, looking at these different sharks that all have the same elastoidin content, is that I would think, based on the test, the biochemistry test from 1978, whatever type of elastoidin you would have used would have only indicated that this pointed to the fibers from the carcass being like elastoidin fibers from a shark. I don't think you could have narrowed it down to a species based on the amino acid content. That's what I'm trying to say.
Yeah.
From the test they did in 1978. Maybe visually, if you looked at the different fibers, morphologically, you could tell the difference. But I'm saying just based on biochemistry, there doesn't seem to be any specific amino acid difference between the different elastoidins of different types of sharks.
And that's very surprising.
Yeah, I just, I was curious about that and decided to look into the question, and that's what I come up with. I mean, it's not a slam dunk, but it's pretty suggestive.
It raises a lot of questions, Scott, that's for
Yeah.
sure.
All right, so moving on. Before we get into any other evidence that would seem to pull the biochemistry evidence back toward a reptilian direction, I want to deal with the one thing that most of the skeptics point to say this is the final nail in the coffin of the case for this carcass being a reptile. So let me bring this up. Let's see here. I'm having to jump around to find what I'm looking for here.
That's okay. Take
All right.
your time.
So let me set this up for you. Okay, as I explained earlier from our last recording session, bony fish have elastoidin fibers too. They're particularly large in sharks, and they're called ceratotrichia. The ones in bony fishes are shorter and are called actinotrichia, but it's still the same thing. It's just a smaller fiber. And it sits on top of a different type of fin ray called lepidotrichia, which is made out of cartilage. And still further removed from sharks and other bony fishes, the lungfish have their own type of ray. And it's called camptotrichia, and it's made out of bone. So what I'm talking about here is that there's evidence that if you follow the evolutionary paradigm, the idea is that when specific types of fish that were ancestral to tetrapods developed limbs instead of fins to progress on land, supposedly these the genetic machinery that makes actinotrichia and ceratotrichia was lost in that transition. You follow me?
Yeah, that's cool.
All right, so this is a paper from Nature magazine or journal from 2010, and it's called Loss of Fish Actinotrichia Proteins and the Fin to Limb Transition by Jing Zhang and co-authors. I'm going to read the abstract here. It says, the early development of teleos paired fins is strikingly similar to that of tetrapod limb buds and is controlled by similar mechanisms. One early morphological difference between pectoral fins and limbs is in the fate of the apical ectodermal ridge, AER, the distal epidermis that rims the bud. Whereas the AER of tetrapods regresses after specification of the skeletal progenitors, the AER of teleos fish forms a fold that elongates. Formation of the fin fold is accompanied by the synthesis of two rows of rigid, unmineralized fibrils called the actinotrichia, which keep the fold straight and guide the migration of mesenchymal cells within the fold. The actinotrichia are made of elastoidin, the components of which, apart from collagen, are unknown. Here we show that two zebrafish proteins, which we name actinodin 1 and actinodin 2, are essential structural components of elastoidin. The presence of actinodin sequences in several teleos fish and in the elephant shark, Calorhynchus milli, which occupies a basal phylogenetic position, but not in tetrapods, suggests that these genes have been lost during tetrapod species evolution. Double gene knockdown of AND1 and AND2 in zebrafish embryos results in the absence of actinotrichia and in impaired fin folds. Gene expression profiles in embryos lacking AND1 and AND2 function are consistent with pectoral fin truncation and may offer a potential explanation for the polydactyly observed in early tetrapod fossils. We propose that the loss of both actinodens and actinotrichia during evolution may have led to the loss of lepidotrichia and may have contributed to the fin-to-limb transition. Now, you get the basic understanding of that, right?
So, what directly are they implying? Yeah, what's the comparative?
They're implying that the genes that produced elastoidin do not exist in tetrapods. They were lost in the evolution from fish to tetrapods. These genes, the AND1 and AND2, which allegedly produce the elastoidin. So you follow me?
Yeah, that I've got. Okay.
Yeah, so the closest, according to current schemes, the closest living fish to tetrapods, or to the tetrapod ancestor, are the lungfish.
Okay.
Right? Now, have you ever heard of a prehistoric lobe-finned fish called Eusthenopteron?
No.
Well, anyway, it was closer related to tetrapods than the living lungfish. It's extinct. It's been gone, I think, since the early Carboniferous.
Okay.
But it was one of the fish that was on the road to becoming a tetrapod. Then you've got other ones like Pandorictes. And then the earliest tetrapod they have is this thing called Acanthostega. It's very fishy, and it still has fin rays in its tail. And there's another one, too, called Ichthyostega. But the fin rays that Ichthyostega and Acanthostega have are lepidotrichia. They have no elastoidin in their tail fin rays.
Okay.
So that ties in with this, too. So basically, somebody that's trying to debunk the idea that the ZUIYO MARU carcass could be anything other than a fish points to this and says, see?
Yeah.
The fibers
from that
in the
perspective, it would seem conclusive.
Were elastoidin, and because elastoidin was lost above all fish in the transition from fish to tetrapods, no tetrapod can have elastoidin. You see the argument?
I see it.
All right.
But is that correct?
Well, I'm fixing to try to deconstruct some of this. You'll bear with me. Now we're headed in the other direction. All right, let me see here. This is a similar paper. And this paper is about lungfish genetic sequence. And it opens up the possibility that maybe some of these genes that were supposedly lost may simply be turned off rather than completely lost. All right, so this is also from Nature, from 2016. This is a paper called The Lungfish Transcriptome, a glimpse into molecular evolution events at the transition from water to land, by Maria Assunta Biscotti and co-authors. And here's the abstract. It says, lungfish and coelacanths are the only living sarcopterygian fish. The phylogenetic relationship of lungfish to the last common ancestor of tetrapods and their close morphological similarity to their fossil ancestors makes this species uniquely interesting. However, their genome size, the largest among vertebrates, is hampering the generation of a whole genome sequence. To provide a partial solution to the problem, a high-coverage lungfish reference transcriptome was generated and assembled. The present findings indicate that lungfish, not coelacanths, are the closest relatives to land-adapted vertebrates. Whereas protein-coding genes evolved at a very slow rate, possibly reflecting a living fossil status, transposable elements appear to be active and show high diversity, suggesting a role for them in the remarkable expansion of the lungfish genome. Analysis of single genes and gene families documented changes connected to the water-to-land transition and demonstrated the value of the lungfish reference transcriptome for comparative studies of vertebrate evolution. Now, moving into the actual paper, here is where we have some indication that it's possible that maybe all those A and D genes weren't completely lost across that transition. It says, okay, now just bear with this. You'll hear what I'm talking about here.
That's good. I'm listening.
We're talking deep science here, okay? Evolutionary retentions and innovations, fin to limb. Actinotrichia are skeletal elements in the fins of Actinotrichia rayfin fish and are homologous to the Ceratotrichia found in chondrichthyes. Both are made of elastoid and a mix of collagenous and non-collagenous proteins. In zebrafish, the actinodin proteins, A and D, of the non-collagen fraction are essential components of Actinotrichia. Outside rayfin fish, sequences encoding these proteins have been identified in the shark C. milli and in Latimeria shalomnae, which is the coelacanth. Actinotrichia of greatly reduced size can still be identified in the fins of Latimeria shalomnae. The fin rays of lungfish, or Camptotrichia, lack actinotrichia and show a unique structure and organization. Actinogen genes have never been detected in any of the tetrapod genomes sequenced to date. This constitutes a notable difference in the otherwise very similar early development of tetrapod limb and fish fin buds. Since loss of these genes during evolution may be related to the water-to-land transition, A and D genes were sought in P. annectans. That's a type of lungfish. The result was a single partial and transcript incomplete at the 5-inch end, likely due to low expression in the tissues analyzed. Analysis of the amino acid sequence disclosed 11 repeats of a motif constituted by the 9 amino acids C, ND, PXX, D, PXC, characteristics of these proteins. Phylogenetic analysis of A and D sequences from representative gnathostomes attributed the lungfish sequence to the A and D 1-2 group. This sequence obtained in the present study allows to trace the evolutionary history of the A and D gene family. The gnathostome ancestor had 2 genes, A and D 1-2 and A and D 3-4. In the teleos ancestor, they underwent a duplication event that led to 4 paralogous genes as a result of teleos genome duplication. The A and D gene homologs detected in lungfish put forward the loss of A and D 1-2 to the tetrapod ancestor. However, The disappearance of the AND34 gene remains unclear. The gene is still found in coelacanths, but not in the pionectin's transcriptome. Although its absence could merely be related to the lack of expression of the tissues analyzed, which do not include RNA sequence from fin tissue, it is possible that AND34 was lost in the common ancestor of lungfish and tetrapods after the split from coelacanths. The lack of evidence for pseudogeneralization of the pionectin's AND1/2 gene, a 1-2 gene, suggests that it may have been recruited for the formation of camptotrichia, which supports the fins in dipnoi. Rapunzel, RPZ, is a recently identified zebrafish gene family comprising 5 paralogous genes that is involved in the number and size of fin rate segments. Their specific functions are not entirely clear. Functional redundancy is likely. Like AND genes, RPZ homologous genes have not been described in the tetrapod clade. 10 non-redundant sequences pertaining to the RPZ gene family were identified in the lungfish transcriptome. This finding might be related to the morphology of lungfish appendages, which present numerous serially repeated elements. The phylogenetic analysis highlighted species-specific duplication events with 4 sequences assigned for the RPZ1, RPZ2, and the 6 assigned to the RPZ, RP5 subgroups. Detection of these genes in lungfish and Actinopterygia suggests their presence in the common ancestor of Actinopterygia and Sarcopterygia, whereas the absence in Latimeria and tetrapods would indicate 2 independent lineage-specific gene loss events. So my understanding of this, there seems to be some question as to whether the AND34 gene is completely lost in the lungfishes or whether it's just dormant.
But, I mean, if it's dormant in the lungfish, surely it should be able to be detected.
Well,
if it isn't detectable, then it's not there.
Well, it depends. Well, the whole point of this paper here is they're still trying to map the lungfish genome.
Mm.
And they're just getting bits and pieces of it, trying to put that together.
Sure.
You follow me?
Understand.
So they haven't got the complete lungfish genome mapped out yet, apparently. So.
Well, that's more.
Maybe it's hiding somewhere there, you know.
Yeah, I think that's more than plausible. I mean, what we're looking for here really is through that wide link is the possibility.
What I'm saying is there's a very slight chance that it made it across a tetrapod boundary and could be dormant in tetrapods.
I see.
All right, which brings us to the next idea, is that what if it was a dormant gene, and when marine reptiles reinvaded the water, perhaps something similar was turned on, a similar genetic machinery, and created elastoidin-like fibers in marine reptiles. So that brings us to our next thing, but if you don't mind, I kind of like to have a little break here.
No, that's fine, absolutely.
All this reading just wears me out.
Yeah, sure.
All right, we're back. So now, let's look at the possible evidence for elastoidin. Very interesting, and obviously very relevant to this whole question. This is a paper that was written in 1982. And unfortunately, I've not been able to find any kind of follow-up. I don't know why, but this is from the Journal of Molecular Evolution, 1982, volume 18, pages 121 through 129. It's a paper called A Comparison of Lizard Claw Keratin Proteins with Those of Avian Beak and Claw by J.M. Gillespie, R.C. Marshall, and E.F. Woods. Division of Protein Chemistry, CSIRO, the company they worked for. All right, so I'm going to read the abstract, just to give you an idea what this is about.
Right.
All right, so it says, summary. The outer shell of translucent keratin has been dissected from the claws of the lizard Varanus gouldi. It is free of calcium and hydroxyproline, in contrast to the fibrous support, and contains proteins rich in glycine, 28 residues, and half cysteine, 13%. These proteins have been obtained in soluble form by treatment from 2-mercaptolithanol in 8M urea at pH 11, followed by alkylation with iodoceti acetate to give S-carboxymethanol keratines. The three major components resolved by SDS polysaccharide gel electrophoresis have been isolated by fractional precipitation with ammonium sulfate followed by chromatography on DEAE cellulose or Cepadex. Two of the components, low in tryptophan content, appear to be homologous and are relatively homologous with respect to both size and charge, whereas the third, a tryptophan-rich material, appears to contain about 20 different molecular species as judged by gel electrophoresis in urea at pH 8.9. The molecular weight of two of the isolated components, the tryptophan-rich and the major of the two tryptophan-poor components, are about 13,000 as determined by equilibrium ultracentrifugation studies. The major lizard claw proteins are therefore similar in size and glycine content to the proteins of avian beak and claw, but differ in containing more cysteine and less tyrosine. On the other hand, the reptilian proteins resemble the mammalian high tyrosine proteins, type 2, in cysteine content and overall amino acid composition, but differ in size, with the lizard proteins being larger. It is suggested, however, they're unlikely to be homologous. Okay, now let me get to the relevant part here.
Okay.
Okay, this is, all right, give me a second here. All right. Results. Composition of the morphological constituents of claw. The three morphological components of claw, namely the fibrous internal support, the outer shell of translucent keratin, and the white membranous lining, were subjected to amino acid and mineral analysis. The fibrous core, Table 1, contains both calcium and hydroxyproline, suggesting that it is bone. Although no X-ray diffraction pattern similar to that of collagen could be obtained. The high content of tyrosine and the comparatively low contents of hydroxyproline, glycine, and alanine suggest the presence of either a very unusual type of collagen or a collagen-like protein such as elastoidin. The white membranous lining of the keratin shell is similar in overall composition to the shell itself and is presumed to be part of the keratin complex, although it contains 50% more tyrosine and differs significantly in a number of other amino acids. So the key sentence here is the high content of tyrosine and comparatively low contents of hydroxyproline, glycine, and alanine suggests the presence of either a very unusual type of collagen or a collagen-like protein such as elastoidin.
It's amazing.
There you go. So there's possible evidence of elastoidin in the claws of a lizard.
That's amazing. You know, I wonder about the
Go ahead.
I just wonder about how we determined from things like plesiosaur fossils and other similar comparative animals at that time that elastoidin wasn't present.
We've got fossilized collagen fibers in the flippers of ichthyosaurs and plesiosaurs.
Mm-hmm.
But the problem is the dicey problem of getting reliable biochemistry information from these fossilized fibers.
Exactly. Yeah.
Because they're so old, and there's a lot of controversy. Yeah. They've been supposedly getting reliable genetic material from fossils of dinosaurs and some marine reptiles, but it's still controversial because they're not sure whether the proteins they're getting out of there have been modified during the fossilization process.
During the fossilization, exactly.
Yeah,
I mean,
it's all there's all sorts of questions. So it's gradually being halfway accepted, but it's still controversial.
Yeah, I mean, because the exclusion is, you could say, is largely based upon an assumption itself, isn't it, from the fossil evidence? And I mean, that's not a get out of jail free card. It doesn't mean we suddenly get to assign it to this carcass, but it does seem to leave a larger gap for something like that.
If you know about the alleged evolution of plesiosaurs from ancestors that had legs with feet, lizard-like creatures called nothosaurs, which had claws, and you look at this evidence for elastoidin-like collagen fibers, at least physically they resemble these fibers. They're definitely collagen fibers. That much has been established. Whether they're specialized collagen fibers like elastoidin, we don't know yet.
Don't know.
But taking this evidence from the lizard claw and adding that to the fibers that have been found in exceptionally well-preserved plesiosaur flippers, you look at the stages of evolution that plesiosaurs went through from their nothosaur ancestors, and it's not a great leap to say that possibly if there is elastoidin in the claws of lizards, maybe there was elastoidin in the claws of nothosaurs, and during the course of evolution, as these feet with claws were evolving into flippers, that elastoidin that was in the claws may have become fibrous and moved into the plesiosaur flipper. You follow me?
I do follow you.
All right, so let's go ahead and look at the evidence from plesiosaur.
Yeah, let's see.
Hang on. Let me find it. Let's see. Holzmann plesiosaur. Where is it? Oh, bear with me.
Okay.
Damn it. I spend half my time trying to find stuff.
I mean, I'm living the same life, Scott.
All right. Now let me enlarge it so I can read it. Okay, Holzmaden is a place in Germany that is known for its exceptionally well-preserved marine reptiles in limestone. Lots of soft tissue preservation has been found in Holzmont. If I remember right, the original Archaeopteryx is from Holzmont, the one that preserved the feathers. So they didn't know that ichthyosaurs had tail fins and dorsal fins until they discovered exceptionally well-preserved ones from Holzmont in the 1890s, which I mentioned earlier. So this is a plesiosaur from Holzmont. This is from a journal called Science and Nature, I assume, 2017, volume 104, number 51. This is a paper called New Insights on the Systematics, Paleoecology, and Paleobiology of a Plesiosaurian with Soft Tissue Preservation from the Toarcian of Holzmont, Germany. The main author is Peggy Vincent. Now, let's see, I'll read the abstract. Let's see. Abstract. The Poseidon and Schiefer Formation Toarcian of Holzmont, Baden-Württemberg in southwestern Germany has yielded several excellently preserved plesiosaurian specimens and received considerable research attention. The plesiosaurians found within these deposits are always significantly outnumbered by ichthyosaurs. And close examination of these rare specimens is crucial to a better understanding of the diversity and paleoecology of plesiosauria in this very peculiar ecosystem. The plesiosaurian specimen SMNS 51945 found in this area is a juvenile individual consisting of a partial crushed skull and an exquisitely preserved postcranial skeleton. Its anatomical characters seem to differ from the long-necked plesiosauroids Microclitus brachypterygius and Coeliosaurus guillemia that are the most abundant taxa within the plesiosaurian assemblage. The postcranial skeleton preserves very likely soft tissues composed of buff-colored and dark-colored structures around the vertebral column and hind limb of the animal. A network of buff-colored fibers located posterior to the hind limb most likely represents phosphatized collagen fibers as already found in some ichthyosaur specimens, confirming that the wing area in plesiosaurians was much larger than that suggested by skeletal remains alone. The specimen also contains gastroliths, sand-sized grains mainly composed of quartz in the stomach cavity, suggesting the animal spent at least some of its time in shallow coastal waters, tens of hundreds of kilometers from the final place of burial. Now let me move on into the actual paper and get to the part about the flipper. Let's see.
Yeah.
Let me find it here. Let me see. Bear with me here.
Go first.
Let's see. So basically what they're saying here, and this has been suggested other places as well, is that if you were to go back in time and see a plesiosaur flipper on one alive, the bony skeleton that you see inside the flipper with the toe bones was probably only half the physical flipper. They're saying here that probably half the flipper was made up of fibers
Okay.
and flesh. In other words, the back end of the flipper was just a fleshy margin,
Mm-hmm.
which probably would have helped it move like a wing.
Mm-hmm.
You know, they flew into water. You already knew that.
Yeah.
All right, so let me see here. Soft tissues. Buff-colored and dark-colored structures are present around the neck, tail, and hind limb of the animal. They are found adjacent to the ventral and dorsal surface of the vertebral column and at the posterior margin of the hind limb, adjacent to the fibula. Let's see. Just navigating around this paper is a pain in the butt. Hang on.
That's okay.
There's so much information here, it's ridiculous. Let me see here. I think I found it. Let's see. Let's see. Because the occurrence of potential soft tissue is exceptional, in plesiosaurians it was decided to avoid destructive analysis that may have helped to establish their chemical or ultrastructural composition. Nevertheless, there is striking resemblance between the dark and buff-colored materials surrounding the neck, tail, and hind limb of SMNS 51945 and the soft tissues documented in several ichthyosaur and cephalopod specimens from the same strata, as well as Centimurian and Colovian Oxfordian ichthyosaurs from the UK and Cretaceous fish from Brazil. In all these fossils, the buff-colored material was interpreted as phosphatized muscle tissue. In the Holzmann ichthyosaur specimen, the buff-colored material was identified as mainly composed of calcium phosphate using dispersive X-ray spectrography and was also interpreted as phosphatized muscle tissues. Let's see. Okay, hang on. Oh, Christ, I can't find it. Hang on a minute.
That's okay, dude. Don't worry.
I'm getting there.
I'm assuming you're editing these bits together anyway.
Well, it's just, the paper's so big and there's so much stuff in it.
No rush at all.
Hang on. All right, here we go. These fibers, which show striking resemblance in size, orientation, and organization in the fibers located posteriorly to the hind limb of SMNS 51945, were interpreted as phosphatized collagen fibers that help to stiffen the dorsal fin in Stenopterygius, which is an ichthyosaur. So what they're saying here is that the fibers from the plesiosaur flipper are very similar to the collagen fibers from the dorsal fin of an ichthyosaur. Mm-hmm. It can thus be hypothesized that the network of fibers located posterior to the left hind limb and SMNS 51943 also represent phosphatized collagen fibers. The scant soft tissue preservation observed in SMNS 51945 has implication for the general body outline and locomotion of plesiosaurians. Assuming that the buff-colored material located posterior to the left hind limb represents phosphatized collagen fibers, it can be hypothesized that such structures, as in the collagen fibers of the dorsal fin of the extant great white shark, Carcharodon carcharias, resulted in considerable stiffening of the soft parts constituting the paddles. Importantly, this buff-colored material extends posteriorly for about the same width as the limb itself. Considering that the bone elements of the skeleton are in close articulation, it can be reasonably assumed that the posterior extension of the soft tissues of the limb underwent limited displacement after burial. So as you just heard me say, they're likening these fibers to the fibers that are found also in the dorsal fin of the great white shark.
Yeah, I think that's an amazing correlation.
Well, you know what kind of fibers, part of the fibers in the dorsal fin of a great white shark are?
What are they?
Elastoidin.
I was hoping you would say that.
Okay, so.
Yeah, I was hoping you would say that.
Come on. I mean, how can you ignore all this, you know?
There's a link. I mean, there's what you're saying is there's definitely a link. I don't know who quite got the, sealed the deal on it, but it's a plausible line of investigation, that's for sure.
I mean, you can't just, you've got elastoidin-like fibers in the well-preserved flipper of a plesiosaur. You can't just ignore that, and that's direct evidence that contradicts what Obata and Tomoda were talking about in their paper they didn't know. The limb supports of marine reptiles are solely skeletal. That's a direct contradiction.
And clearly they didn't know that wasn't available.
I'm not blaming them. I'm saying they didn't know. Yeah, of course. Yeah, and they were pro-reptile, and they didn't know about this. If they'd known about this, the plesiosaur material didn't emerge until 2017.
There you go.
Richard Owen described fibers in an ichthyosaur flipper in 1841. So there was ichthyosaur evidence.
Yeah, I just think it's, again, that exclusion, that original exclusion that was used without evidence at the time, we didn't know whether plesiosaurs had that type of fiber in their flippers. Now that evidence is available, what do you think would happen if we got back to the original evidence and managed to retest?
Let's put one and two together. You've got one paper talking about possibly elastoidin in lizard claw keratin, which is a lizard's a reptile. Mm-hmm. And then, on the other hand, you've got possibly elastoidin-like fibers in the flipper of a plesiosaur.
Yeah, no, exactly.
Putting the two of these together, come on,
I'm with you. I'm with you.
Really, anybody that says you're supposed to ignore this is an idiot. In my opinion, I'm sorry.
So again, coming back to that, you mentioned in the earlier part of these conversations that the original overreach by both the creationist camp and the scientific community has led to a sort of an avoidance of the matter, an uncomfortable checkmate, which nobody's come back to this evidence again for fear of either embarrassment or opening up.
Well, a lot of the shark arguments are stuck in 1978, and it shouldn't be that way. We got technology now that blows the technology that was available in 1978 to pieces for identifying shark carcasses that look like plesiosaurs. But that doesn't give us direct information about the ZUIYO MARU carcass, because these techniques are reliant on biological analysis of a physical specimen. So unless we can get a piece of the ZUIYO MARU carcass that still exists today, we can't apply that technology to the ZUIYO MARU carcass.
Yeah.
So,
I think
it's a sort of a circular argument.
In a way, but I think you've definitely put forward more plausible reasons for that research to continue.
If there's still pieces of that carcass at Shizuoka University, we might have a fighting chance to solve this mystery once and for all.
I'm going to call them. I'm going to call them and try to ask about it, try to get through to somebody at least. might know about its whereabouts.
Yeah.
It would be quite old, as you say, and it would be interesting for us to do a little research on what could happen to a sample of that age. You know, what could happen over time. Would it even be valid? You mentioned the bleaching method that was used initially.
Yeah.
With the fiber as well. Yeah.
That's probably, probably still residues of that still on the fibers, I would think. I don't know.
Yeah, I should think so.
But with the techniques they've got today, they can identify the fibers from a basket shark from a bowl of soup now.
There you go.
That's environmental DNA right there.
Exactly.
Yeah, so if we could just, even if the fibers degraded with the type of technology they have now, that might not matter. I just don't know.
I really hope
it would behoove us to try,
I definitely would like to try. I think there's enough in here for a new serious investigation.
Yeah.
And I think the link that you've made today definitely at least makes it plausible now.
Well, my original intentions
of an unknown creature.
My original intentions were to go from the lizard to the ichthyosaur to the plesiosaur and then modern sea turtle evidence. We've just about run out of time today, but I think what we're going to do is when we pick up episode 3, we'll discuss the ichthyosaur and modern sea turtle evidence of fibers.
And by that time, hopefully, I would have got some feedback from
the university. Another avenue to go at this too is to try to get some fibers from a leatherback turtle flipper and compare them with the data from the papers from 1978, and also if we can get access to a still existing piece of the original carcass, compare that too,
That would be amazing.
Yeah.
That would be amazing.
There's all
I will be calling them this week with my best Japanese.
We could go on this if we had access to the material we needed and the technology we needed,
Yeah.
And believe me, it's not from lack of trying. I've done everything I could to try to do something about this.
It may be close, but it's worth trying.
Yeah.
And definitely worth trying and just seeing how far we can get. I think there's so much in this to prompt a new exhaustive investigation.
Yeah.
I'd love to be a part of it.
I mean, we've already talked about so much important stuff relative to this case, but we still got so much more relevant stuff to talk about, pro-shark and pro-marine reptile.
Yeah.
I mean, there's two sides to every story, and the shark people have a convincing case as well.
Yeah, I think so.
So I'm not trying to back away from that. I'm just trying to take it in chunks. I'm trying to sort of baby feed it to the audience so they'll understand the complexities of what's going on with this whole case,
Yeah, it's not a cut.
I mean, in other words, in order to get a rational idea of what we're talking about, you've got to not only know about shark anatomy and shark biology, you've got to know a lot about fossil marine reptiles and living marine reptiles and all this stuff too,
Absolutely.
And as we said before, scientific politics figures into this too.
Well, I think philosophical slant of people, I've started to realize that after reevaluating my own, once I rewrote my initial book, reevaluating my own philosophical prejudice and thinking, actually, a lot of what you're espousing here, Andy, you can't justify. It's just philosophically what you would prefer.
Well, if I was
it's really opened up my eyes, as to how that affects
nonsense, and somebody told me to shut up, I'd shut up. But I'm not talking nonsense.
No, it's not nonsense.
And anybody tells me to shut up about this can kiss my ass, because what I'm talking about here is science.
I like it.
I am talking science.
No, I like
I just
it.
happen to be talking science that perhaps they don't want to hear, but it's still science.
It's important. It's important because people don't
Yeah.
ask the risky questions anymore. They just don't do it. Because if you're in...
I totally understand the concept of parsimony.
Mm.
But what I'm saying is that there's so much additional information that has popped up since 1978 that's relevant to the analysis of this carcass, things that we didn't know about, that we need to step back and take a second look at this.
Mm. Yeah. And not for one camp or the other, just to establish the final results, because I think it's got to be we'll be Switzerland in this. We'll be neutral,
well,
right? And
I hate to say it, but we've run out of time for this episode. So we'll get back to this after I get back from Altamaha.
Oh, that's right. You're going down to see Alti this week.
Yeah, so anyway, we're on a roll here, I think.
Yeah, enthralling, absolutely devastating information.
I'm sure some people will be livid about what I said in this program, but that's their problem.
That's a good thing. It'll get them thinking about the case again. And if they want to disprove it, if they want to prove you wrong, they might come up with some more evidence we don't have.
Am I getting my stuff out of the Weekly World News, or am I arguing from science journals?
Mm.
I'm giving you the quotes right there, you know? All right, well, I'll see you next go round.
Awesome. See you soon.
Yep.